The exodus of Israel out of the land of Egypt, in my opinion, is probably one of the greatest events that's recorded in the Old Testament. And it's not just an interesting event to study from a historical perspective, but we as Christians today know that it's actually in the New Testament, it's a paradigm, a pattern, or an example or a shadow of our salvation. And when you think about the children of Israel and that generation that came up out of the land of Egypt, I know probably most, or at least this is the way that I often think of them. I often think of them about a bunch of complainers and grumblers. And they did a lot of that, but they also accomplished one of the greatest acts of faith that we read about in the Bible. And that's what we're going to be talking about this morning. Not only that event, but also some other things that are recorded in Hebrews chapter 11 and verses 27 through 29. If you have your Bibles, be turning over there. I'm going to take a minute to turn on my fan here. And we'll read about those events. Now, the focus of most of these verses, like last week, is on Moses himself, because Moses is the leader of God's people in the Exodus. But in Hebrews 11, verse 27 beginning, the Hebrew writer says, "By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king. For he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Through faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by on dry land, which the Egyptians, essaying to do, were drowned." We want to study these examples in these three verses this morning and look at it from the perspective of how faith can help us to overcome our fears. And I think there's some good and interesting things that are pointed out within this passage itself that will help each one of us, be beneficial to each one of us as Christians. One of the things that we learn about the faith of Moses is Moses wasn't afraid of Pharaoh. Moses wasn't afraid of the king. He wasn't afraid of any commandment that Pharaoh had made. And that's evident there in verse 27 of Hebrews 11. It says, "By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king." Now, that statement, this first part of that verse, has, if you start reading commentators, you're going to get into this big debate as to when exactly is this event talking about. The King James Version says that he forsook Egypt. The literal meaning of those words is that he left Egypt, or he left behind Egypt. And so basically, when we look at the life of Moses, we know that there's two times that he left Egypt. The first one was after he killed the Egyptian. And of course, he leaves Egypt to the land of Midian for about 40 years. He comes back to Egypt and begins leading God's people, but then he leaves Egypt once again whenever all of Israel begins to exodus out of that land. And so the question becomes, which one of these deeds, which one of these departures are we reading about here in Hebrews 11 verse 27? Because it says when he left Egypt, he did not fear the wrath of the king. And when you go back and you look at the story of after Moses killed the Egyptian, the first thing in Exodus chapter 2 and verse 14, it says there that Moses feared whenever his brethren asked him the question, "Are you going to kill me like you killed that Egyptian yesterday?" That Moses was afraid. And so a lot of commentators will look at that and say, well, there's no way that this can be the first leaving of Moses, because it says when he left Egypt, he did not fear the wrath of the king. I want to point out a couple of things, and this is just observations from a study standpoint, I guess you could say, of Hebrews chapter 11. Because as you begin going through the chapter, it's pretty obvious to me that everything that we're reading about happened in chronological order. You can go back at the beginning of the chapter, you can start with how the worlds were framed by the Word of God. You can study about Abel, and then you can study about Enoch, and then you can read about Noah, and then you come to Abraham, and then you read about Sarah, and then you read about them having a son, and then Abraham being commanded to offer that son. And then we go through the descendants of Abraham. We get into Isaac, and we read about Jacob and Esau, and then we read about Joseph. And then we get into a statement in Hebrews 11 about the parents of Moses, how they hid him when he was just a baby. And then we begin reading about Moses himself, and last week we started in verse 24, studying about how he forsook Egypt, or how he chose not to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He refused, some versions say, to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. And he chose to suffer affliction with the people of God, rather to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. And then you get into verse 27, where it says that he left Egypt. And then you go on to verse 28, and you'll read about how he kept the Passover. And then you'll read about, in verse 29, how he passed through the Red Sea. And the point that I'm trying to make is, if this narrative is in chronological order, as it seems to be, the only leaving that could be in mind here in verse 27 is the first one. Because after he leaves, in verse 28, he keeps the Passover. And then in verse 29, he walks through the Red Sea. So that would have had to happen before those things. Now, I'm not going to be dogmatic about that. I'm just saying it just looks at, from a chronological standpoint, that as the writer is writing, he's explaining things that happen on a timetable. Now, what does that do? Well, to some people, that creates a problem, because they look at Exodus 2:14, where it says that Moses feared when he heard that saying, and said, this can't be the first time he left. Because when he left Egypt, he was not afraid, he did not fear the wrath of the king. And so let me go back to Exodus chapter 2. If you have your Bibles, you can turn back there with me for just a few moments. And we want to kind of read this story and talk about some of the ideas, and kind of set things within the context and the order in which they happen. Now, I want to emphasize beginning in verse 11 here in Exodus chapter 2, I think we're reading about a choice that Moses has already made. Moses has chosen to suffer affliction with his people, rather to enjoy the pleasures or the treasures of Egypt. And so in verse 11 it says, it came to pass in those days, when Moses was grown, that he went out unto his brethren and looked on their burdens, and he spied an Egyptian smiting an Hebrew, one of his brethren. And he looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Now there's a couple of things that stand out about this story. Number one, Moses was conscious of his surroundings. Okay, whenever he enters into this act, it wasn't like he was blind to anything and everything that was going on around him. In fact, the Bible emphasizes there in verse 12 that he looked this way and he looked that way. In other words, he was looking around to see, is there anybody who's going to see me do this? Now, is there anybody who's going to have any knowledge of me performing this act? And so he looks around, he doesn't see anybody, and in his mind, I think what he's thinking is, well, I can do this, and nobody's going to even know. Nobody's even going to know that it's me. Even if the body is found, nobody's going to be able to pin this on me, to point back to me in this act. And so what does he do? Well, he interjects himself into that argument. It leads to the death of that Egyptian. And so he made a choice there to side with his people and not with the Egyptians themselves. Now look at verse 13 in that chapter. Here's the interesting statement to me. When he went out the second day. Well, what does it mean the first day? Why are we talking about numbers here? I think, again, what the writer has in mind, the first day that Moses made the choice, I'm not going to be an Egyptian anymore. I'm going to side with the Israelites. I'm going to go out here with my people. The first day, he interjects himself into this argument, and it winds up to the killing of this Egyptian. Well, the second day of this decision, he goes out, and behold, in verse 13, it says, 2 men of the Hebrews strove together. And he said to him that did the wrong, wherefore smitest thou thy fellow? And he said, who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killedest the Egyptian? Notice this, and Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. Now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses, but Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. A couple of things that I want to emphasize. Number one, Hebrews 11 verse 27 says, Moses did not fear the wrath of the king. Okay, Moses had made this choice. And maybe in Hebrews 11:27, maybe we're trying to take the leaving of Egypt a little too literally. And maybe it's not talking about him physically walking out of the land, but maybe it's talking about the fact that in his mind he made the conscious decision, I'm leaving Egypt behind. Okay, I'm going to go over here and I'm going to join with my fellow children of God, my fellow servants, the Israelites. And so he wasn't afraid of Pharaoh when he made that choice. Moses didn't care what Pharaoh had to say about it. He didn't care what commandment or what law Pharaoh might put into action because he made that choice. He did not fear the wrath of the king when he decided he was going to leave Egypt behind. And so what does he do on the first day? Well, he winds up killing an Egyptian. On the second day, he figures out this situation the day before that I thought nobody would know anything about, everybody knows about it. And so in his mind, his process is if this is known, if people know that I'm the one who killed this Egyptian, it's only going to be a matter of time before Pharaoh himself knows. And the thinking of Moses proved exactly true. Notice what happens here. Well, we read in Exodus 2:13 through 15. In verse 15 it says, when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay or to kill Moses. So exactly what Moses had envisioned had come to pass. Now Moses' life was in danger. But even though there may have been a fear that was associated with him losing his life, it didn't keep him from doing what was right. It didn't keep him from making the choices that he made. And so he wasn't afraid of Pharaoh when it came to doing what was right. He wasn't afraid of becoming a leader and a deliverer of Israel. That's what he wanted there. When he talked about to his brethren the second day, he wanted to deliver Israel. He wanted to be their leader. He was not afraid to go against any commandments of the king. But let me also emphasize to you, if Moses wasn't afraid when Pharaoh put out a hit on him, so to speak, then he was the dumbest person alive. Can you imagine a ruthless leader like Pharaoh? Even in our own country, could you imagine today if the President of the United States put out an order to put you to death personally? Would you be afraid? Well, I'm going to say if we weren't afraid, then something was wrong with it. Somebody says, would you run? Of course I would run, wouldn't you? Did Elijah run whenever Jezebel put out an order on his life? Yes, he did. It's only natural to react in a way where men try to spare their life. And so it wasn't that fear kept Moses from doing what was right. He made the right choice. He chose to suffer affliction with the people of God rather than enjoy the pleasures and the treasures of Egypt. He chose to be Israel's deliverer and Israel's leader rather than a prince within the Egyptian society itself. It wasn't that he didn't make the right choices or that Pharaoh's bearing on him or thinking or even the laws that were in effect kept him from doing what was right. And so I want to emphasize, maybe when we read back here in Hebrews 11:27 that he left Egypt behind, maybe we're taking that too literally. Because Moses left Egypt behind in his mind. He wasn't afraid of any commandment that Pharaoh had to give or what he would say about it. But I'll guarantee you, when Pharaoh was trying to kill him, he was afraid. And he ran for his life. But what's interesting is in verse 27, and we've been emphasizing this rightly so in our studies, it says, by faith he left Egypt. What does that mean? If you do something by faith, that means you have to have revelation, don't you? You have to have a commandment from God. And so if it is literally leaving Egypt, he did because that's what God told him to do. He couldn't have done it by faith, other words. But he was not afraid about what Pharaoh had to say when he forsook Egypt. He wasn't afraid to join the Israelites. Fear did not keep him from doing what is right. And that's the point that I want us to get out of this. When we talk about overcoming fear, what's going to help us to overcome fears that we're going to face in this life? Well, it's our faith. And if we have true faith in God, true trust, confidence in God, and in His commandments and in His promises, we're not going to care what any earthly dominion says or does. We're not going to care what men might say, what they might think. We're not going to care what kind of laws have been passed and put into effect. Earthly dominion is not going to keep us from doing what is right. And that was the great example of Moses. He simply believed and trusted and confided in God, and he just did what God told him to do and let the cards fall where may. The second thing that I want to emphasize in these verses here in Hebrews 11, 27 through 29, is even though faith never fears earthly dominion, it always fears deity. It always has this healthy respect for God and for his commandments, and it always listens to him. And so you see in Hebrews 11, verse 27, the second part of that verse, it says, "For he endured as seeing him who is invisible." So Moses leaves Egypt. He's not afraid of any commandment of the king, but he endures because he's able to see him who is invisible. You know, God's people have always triumphed over fear. When you go back and you look through any example that you'll find in the Bible, when God's people triumphed over fear, it's because they were seeing the invisible. And so what helped Moses triumph over these difficult choices in life? What made him overcome, the fear of what Pharaoh might say or what Pharaoh might do? It's because he was able to see God. That's how David triumphed over Goliath. That's how the three friends of David, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, triumphed over the fiery furnace. They were able to see God. Nebuchadnezzar and the other men finally saw him, but they were able to see him who was invisible. And so that's how Moses triumphed over Pharaoh. That's how he overcame Egypt, because he was able to see him who was invisible. There's an interesting statement, though, in the middle of that verse, in verse 27. It says that he endured. And, we talked about how Moses is looking at him who is invisible, but again, I want to emphasize this point. I know I've emphasized it several times in this study, but I'm going to do it again because I think it's a good observation. He endured. What does that mean? Does that mean it was easy for Moses to do what he did? When you think about enduring, is that something, when it pops into your mind, well, that's something easy, right? No, it always carries with it the idea of somebody who's able to persevere, and they're able to persevere because of their spiritual strength. What made Moses able to persevere through all these things? He was able to see God. He was able to see the being who is invisible. And so we read about how Moses leaves Egypt, whether you want to take it literally or figuratively. And we know that after he literally left Egypt the first time, that he goes to the land of Midian. And he stays there for a number of years. In fact, as Stephen is giving a short history of the people of God, of the nation of Israel in Acts chapter 7, in verse 30 he says this about Moses. He said, when 40 years were expired, there appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai an angel of the Lord in the flame of a fire in a bush. Moses endured. Think about those 40 years of the life of Moses. Now, I have an idea that maybe when you first get into Midian and you get a change of a scenery and things like that, maybe it was kind of refreshing for Moses. But then 10 years go by. And then 10 years turns into 20 years. And then 20 years turns into 30. And then 30 years turns into 40. And so what do you think was going through the mind of Moses and his faith? Well, in his mind, he's supposed to be this leader of Israel, isn't he? He's supposed to deliver his nation out of the hands of the Egyptians. For 40 years, he's out here keeping sheep in the wilderness. What do you think that did to his confidence? Well, I think if he was a normal human being, it would have done what it would do to anybody. His confidence had to slowly drain away. That the idea of being a leader of Israel was probably some dim memories and maybe some bitter memory because of what happened and how he had to leave. But it wasn't what it was when he came up out of Egypt. I know that. It wasn't the same. And so here you read about Moses, and for these 40 years of his life, the first 40 years of his life, he's being trained, he's being built up to become a somebody. And then the next 40 years he spends basically becoming a nobody, right? All these things he prepared and trained for are 40 years in the past. And so what happens? Well, God speaks to Moses from the burning bush. We know the story. And he says, go deliver my people out of the land of Israel. Now, probably most, if not all of us, are familiar with Exodus 3 and Exodus 4, where, there's some reservations. I'll just put it that way. There's some reservations that Moses has in mind. But I want you to think about it from a human perspective, okay? What were you doing 40 years ago? Now, for some of you, you say, well, I wasn't even alive 40 years ago. Yeah, well, I was a very, very, very young child at that point. But what were you doing 40 years ago? Think about how your life has changed from 40 years ago. Think about the things that were important to you 40 years ago, and the things that you were knowledgeable about, and the things that you were vested in to where you are now. So 40 years go by. And then God suddenly appears to Moses in this burning bush, and he says, well, it's time. Now it's time for you to go lead Israel out of Egypt. What do you think went through the mind of Moses? Well, I would probably think Moses said, well, I got a job now. I'm working out here. I'm a shepherd. I've got a wife. Got a family. I've got 2 boys. It's not a good time for me to be the leader of Israel now. And think about what he had went through during those 40 years. Did people know him anymore in Egypt? Well, no. He was much better known the first time, wasn't he? Did he have any kind of influence in the Egyptian society after 40 years? Not a chance. He would have had a lot more influence in the beginning. And I'm convinced in my mind, whether it's true or not, I'm convinced in my mind that God undid all those things. So in the end, the children of Israel and Moses couldn't say, well, it all happened because I was the son of Pharaoh's daughter. No, it was all going to happen because of God. And so after all those things are undone, after Moses has gone from a somebody to a nobody, God says it's time for you to lead the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. And so what does Moses do? He endured those 40 years by keeping his eyes on God. And we read in Exodus 3 and 4 again, questions that Moses had that any common sense person would have had when God told him to go do something. He says, who am I? Nobody knows me anymore. Nobody's going to recognize me. Nobody's going to want to follow me. He's just this random Israelite that marches into Egypt and starts telling all the Israelites what to do. And then he says in chapter 4 and verse 1, well, what if they don't believe me? Well, did they believe him the first time? Moses said, what? I'll be your deliverer. I'll be your leader. And the people said, who made you our judge? Who made you our deliverer? What if they don't believe me this time? What's going to make sure that what happened in the beginning doesn't repeat itself this time? Well, God gave him, he said, throw down your rod, it became a snake. He said, pick it up, it became a rod. He said, put your hand in your bosom or under your robe, and it turned leprous. He said, put it in there again, and then it was clean. So God gave him some reassurance. He said, if they don't believe any of that, you're going to pour out water in Egypt, and it's going to be turned into blood. So I guess that kind of convinced Moses, well, they'll believe me this time. I got a little more evidence on my side now. But God convinces him to go back. And when you read about Moses when he goes back, he boldly confronts Pharaoh time and time again. What led to his return? It was his faith, wasn't it? It was the ability to see God. Yeah, he had some doubts. He had some questions. Did he have some fears? Yeah, he did. But he overcame all those things because of his faith in God. And so he endured by looking to God rather than looking to men or looking at his physical circumstances or even looking to himself. And that's where our faith needs to be. It needs to be in God. It needs to be in the one who's invisible, not in men here upon this earth, not in our physical circumstances, not in our abilities and our learning, but our faith in God. And so what do we read about? We read about the death of the firstborn. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 28, it says, "Through faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them." The verse is talking about the 10th and the final plague that was brought upon the land of Egypt, the death of the firstborn. We read about that in Exodus chapter 11, and beginning about verse 1, where the Lord says to Moses, he says, "Yet I will bring one more plague upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt, and afterwards he will let you go hence. When he shall let you go, he will surely thrust you out hence altogether." Now what's interesting in verse 28 is, it says, "Through faith he," Moses, "kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood." Sometimes when we think about the Passover, I think we think, well, the Passover was the sprinkling of the blood of the lamb on the doorpost. Well, that was part of it. But the Passover was much more involved than just that. Remember, the Passover involved the killing of this certain lamb and the preparing of the meat in a certain way. And they were supposed to roast it in the fire, the fastest way that you can cook it. They weren't supposed to boil it or do anything else with it. Roast it in a fire. It was supposed to be eaten at nightfall. And then you took the blood of that lamb, you put the blood on the doorpost and over the top. But do you realize that Israel observed the first Passover before the 10th plague ever happened? It was through faith that they observed this killing of the animal. In fact, whenever the commandment about the Passover was given, remember in Exodus chapter 12, they were to eat it with their belt on their waist, with their sandals on their feet, and with their staff in their hand. In other words, God is saying, you be ready to go. They were to bind up their kneading troughs. Remember, at night they would the people would often prepare the bread for the next day, and during that they would put a little bit of leaven in that and allow it to rise overnight and be cooked. God said, you're going to eat unleavened bread. You don't have time for the leaven to work. Because this night, this very night, when I do this plague, when I bring it upon Egypt, you're going to be thrown out. And do you remember what time it happened during the night? God told Moses and Pharaoh, he said, about midnight, this is what I'm going to do. And there's no doubt in my mind that every Egyptian was up at midnight walking around the house to make sure it didn't happen. And sometimes I think when we think of the death of the firstborn, we think, well, you know, it happened in this house, and then 2 seconds later it happened in this house, and 3 seconds later it happened. No, it was all at one time. In one time, in one swoop, the angel of the Lord killed all the firstborn in the land of Egypt. It was about midnight. And what was happening, those Egyptians were up watching and waiting because they knew what happened all those other 9 times. Moses said this was what was going to happen. And so immediately, when you read the account, Pharaoh calls Moses by night. Immediately after his firstborn son dies, he calls Moses by night. And he says, you guys get your stuff and you get out of here. And they left by night. Somebody says, well, how'd they see? Well, read about the fiery pillar that guided them. That's how they saw. God guided them out of there. But before they did that, they ate the Passover. They observed the Passover in preparation, in faith of what was going to happen very, very soon. And so it was by faith that Moses kept the Passover, and it was the sprinkling of the blood. You know, how could blood on the doorpost keep the firstborn from dying in some houses? I don't know. God said it would, and it did. And they trusted in what God said. And so they feared deity. They honored and they respected God. They did what God commanded them to do, but they didn't have any fear for any earthly dominion. The last thing that we read about in verse 29 is the detour that they have to take through the Red Sea. It says, by faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, which the Egyptians, assaying to do, were drowned. I'm not going to go back and read the story. I think all of us know it. But if you read in Exodus 14, verses 10 through 14, Pharaoh lets Israel go. He's full of regret. And so he chases him down with his chariots to bring him back. And as he's getting close to them, the Egyptians are bearing down on the Israelites from behind. The Red Sea is in front of them. The land has kind of closed them in here where they're in a natural trap. And you remember what the people do? The people start notice the contrast there. We're not going to read it, but go back and read it if you have time. Notice the contrast between the attitude of the people and the attitude of Moses. People said, oh, you brought us out here to die in the wilderness because there's no graves in Egypt, huh? We're dead men. There's nothing that's going to save us now. They start grumbling and they start complaining. And Moses makes a statement to them in verse 13. He says, don't be afraid. He says, be still, be quiet, and you'll see the salvation of the Lord. And all these Egyptians who you see today, you'll never see them again. That's a pretty bold statement, isn't it? That's a pretty confident statement. But here are all the people saying, well, what's going to happen to us? We're going to die. And Moses said, no, you're not. God's going to fight for you. God's going to deliver you. And in fact, you're not going to see one of these Egyptians that is standing here today alive anymore. Well, think about what happens. The Red Sea divides. The people step forward into the divided sea. Do you think it took faith to step into the divided sea? Think about that for a minute. I remember I saw a meme. You've probably seen it before. I think I probably saw it on Facebook. But pictures the Israelites walking through the Red Sea, and here's this guy with this fishing pole that's cast into the side of the water, and it says there's one in every crowd. What would you be doing as you went through there? Would you be walking? Man, I'd be running, wouldn't you? I wouldn't be letting any grass grow under my feet. I'd be pushing my family and everything that I had as quickly as I could, because it wasn't like you were walking through waters where there was glass that was holding up the waters on both sides. The Bible says the wind was holding the waves back. The wind was holding the water. It had divided the waters, and now here you were walking through the middle of those waters. Did that take trust and confidence in God? Absolutely. And so it was through faith, or by faith, that the children of Israel passed through the Red Sea. Remember in 1 Corinthians 10:2, Paul talks about how the waters were on their right hand and on their left, and then it wasn't like you could look up and see the sky and say, well, there's an out. The cloud was covering them in the top. I'm kind of claustrophobic myself, so I don't know how I would have felt about that situation. But here you were immersed in all these things, and it took faith for the children of Israel to walk through that sea. How did they do it? They let faith overcome their fear. They let their trust and their confidence in God not keep them from doing what God commanded. You read about Moses' faith. Moses' faith inspired other people to have faith too. That's one of the great things about faith. Faith is contagious. You read about Moses' parents. They were not afraid of the king's command. They hid their son. Guess what their son wasn't afraid of? He wasn't afraid of the king's command either. He did what God had asked him to do. And so you see this fearless faith even in the face of world power. You think about what is unbelief. Unbelief is the opposite of faith. The opposite of faith is fearing the king. The opposite of faith is cringing before worldly powers, caving in under pressure and opposition. Moses did not do those things. And why did he not do those things? Because he was able to see the invisible God. Other people may not have been able to see him. And friends, I want to encourage us as we think about fears in this world, be able to see the invisible God. Doesn't matter if your friends can see it. Doesn't matter if your family members or your neighbors can see him. You be able to see the invisible God. And if you can see the invisible God, then the faith that you have in him, the confidence and the trust, can deliver us from the fear of any other power that is present here in this world. My question for you this morning is fear keeping you from doing what is right? Didn't keep Moses from doing what was right. Have you obeyed the gospel of Christ? You might say, well, I don't know. There's something in my life, or, somebody else might think this, or somebody else might. Where's your faith? Is your faith in yourself? Is your faith in your friends and in your family? Or is it in the invisible God? Do not be afraid. Trust in God. Confide in him. Fear deity. Don't fear men. If you need to obey the gospel, if you're an erring child of God who needs to respond in a public way, if there's any way that we can help you this morning, we'd encourage